My guess this evening is that our sermon tonight may strike a bit close to home for a few of you. I know that some of you are going through sorrow in your lives, frankly, because of broken relationships. There's times that you've had people who are closest friends, but now they are no longer talking to you because something has happened that has ruptured your relationship. For others, that relational rupture is even closer to home. It's within your family members, and you're estranged from them. And you wish these situations were not the reality of your life, but they are. One of the greatest yearnings that some of you have, I know, is to have reconciliation with someone. And you're hoping that will occur soon. Yet, based on everything you've seen so far to this point in your life, these do not seem to be a possibility. Reconciliation does not seem to be happening. That's what leads to this sorrow that I know some of you are dealing with. Well, let me warn you, if you're one of those tonight, your yearning for reconciliation is going to be stirred anew. Of course, as we see reconciliation this evening in our text, it will also serve as encouragement. No matter how distant reconciliation may look, no matter how unlikely it appears, regardless of what we may think about it, the possibility is real. God can do great things. We're working through the long reunification process with Joseph. It's covered many chapters in this series in Genesis that really deals with Jacob and his sons. There was hatred between Joseph and his brothers, excluding Benjamin, his immediate brother, his full brother. And we've seen this hatred that began all the way back in chapter 37. Well, as you can see on screen, we're in chapter 45 now. A long time has gone in between. We've watched in these intervening chapters as Joseph has tested his brothers through a complex set of trials that he set up to see over the course of 2 trips that they made down to Egypt to buy grain whether or not they had changed. Joseph's brothers, as you recall, had no idea that the ruler that they were buying grain from there in Egypt was their brother Joseph. They had sold him in slavery decades ago, and for all they knew, they assumed he was dead. Judah even made that clear last week, that Judah, speaking on behalf of the brothers, assumed that Joseph was long dead. Well, in a similar fashion, Joseph, he has no idea if these brothers that have come before him there in Egypt, if they're the same self-centered, hate-filled men that they were in his early life, or if they're different guys now, if they've changed. He's wondering, has God transformed them in the intervening years? Well, to determine whether or not that happened, Joseph put them to these tests. And he wanted to see what would be revealed. He set up several situations that allowed most of the brothers the opportunity to sacrifice one brother to preserve their own lives and well-being. After all that was somewhat like what happened years ago to him when they sacrificed him just for their own well-being. They were willing to sacrifice his life so that their lives would be pleasant. So now are they willing to sacrifice one life rather than their own? Or even more specifically, would they give up Benjamin, the one that is Joseph's full brother, because he's most likely the one they would still hate? Or would they risk their own lives instead? Well, we really saw, thankfully, last week that Judah, who had become the spokesman for all the others, he was willing to sacrifice his own life rather than sacrifice Benjamin. He offered to take Benjamin's place when Joseph, the ruler of Egypt, was going to hold Benjamin as a slave. Now, what we did not see is whether or not Joseph would accept Judah's offer or not. As one person mentioned this morning, we were really left with a cliffhanger last week. I don't think two of you probably chewed your fingernails too far to the nubs because most of you probably knew the answer. But it really did end on cliffhanger. Judah said, I'll take his place. And then it's like, well, you got to come back next week for the same bat channel, same bat story, and see what happens. Well, here we are next week. We're going to see what happens. Tonight we're picking up immediately on the heels of Judah's self-sacrificial offer. Judah offered to serve as an Egyptian slave so that Benjamin, the one that his father loved so severely, could return. Judah said he could not bear that his father would lose another beloved son as he had lost the first one, Joseph, many years ago. Well, let's pick up where we left off last week. Joseph reveals himself finally at long last, verse 1 of chapter 45. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, "Have everyone go out from me." So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Now we're going to stop right there for now. My plan is to work through our text relatively slowly tonight. The tension between Joseph and his brothers, it's existed all the way since chapter 37. And in reality, that tension that's been built up for all these chapters, it's resolved very quickly. It's recorded in a very fast 15 verses. My fear, though, is if we simply read through these 15 verses at the rate that we can, we'll miss some of the details of how God has spent years preparing for these rapid few minutes now in the lives of Jacob's sons. There were times during each visit prior that Joseph was brought nearly to tears, or brought to tears even, by things that the brother had said among themselves, or just even the simple sight of Benjamin. Joseph's emotions have been stirred. In those earlier cases, though, Joseph, he hid his emotions from his brothers. He did not want to give away who he was. Well, that's no longer a concern. After what Joseph saw from Judah, he no longer attempts to hide his emotions from his brothers. Now, rather, he seeks to hide his emotions from the Egyptian attendants. Judah's offer to exchange his life for Benjamin it's overwhelmed Joseph, so he quickly orders everyone out of the room, aside from his brothers, and he reveals himself in private to them. Look carefully at verse 1. 9 times since the brothers have arrived in Egypt, on the second trip, 9 times in chapters 33 and 34, they've been referred to as the men. Look how they're referred to now in verse 1 of chapter 45. His brothers. Now, we've known all along they're his brothers, right? That's not new information to us, but Moses is shifting the language here to note a shift in the emotional relationship that Joseph has with his brothers because of Judah's offer. They're no longer the men, now they're his brothers. Joseph may have sent all the attendants out of the room, but that does not mean that what happened in the room remains secret. Remember, they didn't exactly have storm windows that they pulled so that air conditioning would be able to run. The windows are wide open holes in the wall, and they heard everything going on. The people in the house heard Joseph crying. Surely they could tell it's not a cry of distress. This is something else. It's a joyful cry. Most likely, they could even hear some of the words being said. Maybe not make out exactly what they're saying, but they could hear the tone of speech that's going back and forth between Joseph and his brothers. In fact, most likely at this point, Joseph switches to Hebrew. So even they heard the words, most of the attendants would have no idea what he's saying. After all, there's no longer an interpreter in the room. Up till now, there's always been that interpreter between them. In fact, what happened in the room as Joseph was crying with his brothers was such big news that it immediately was passed along to Pharaoh's household. I've got to imagine that as it went to Pharaoh's household, it quickly made it all the way to Pharaoh's ear. You know, it's kind of like you see happen with our president. All of a sudden somebody leans in and whispers in his ear. That's the picture I get in my mind anyway of what's going on here. Pharaoh hears quickly that Joseph's family has arrived. Through his tears here, Joseph blurts out, I am Joseph. Just think for a moment, can you imagine the mental dissonance that must have come with the brothers attempting to process those words? They have bowed before this ruler in fear, in terror for their lives, multiple times. They've dined with him, but always nervous. He's the ruler. You know, he sat up away. They're down at a separate table. There's a distance between them. Just moments ago, they're begging for their lives, literally. Judah saying, please take me instead of my brother. And then all of a sudden these words, I am Joseph. They're bowing before him right at this moment, pleading, and they hear those words. Suddenly, they hear an emotional command, take them away. That's probably something they would have expected. In fact, when they heard, have everyone go out for me, they're probably thinking, oh no, he's sending us away. Because it would make perfect sense to them that Joseph would say, get them out of here. What would not make sense is, I am Joseph. That name has not even been mentioned in any interaction between the brothers and the rulers to this moment. Joseph was always the one that was. They've never used the word Joseph, the name. I've got to believe that the absolute last thing they would have ever expected to hear from this mighty ruler is the name Joseph. Let alone, I am Joseph. Notice Joseph immediately follows his announcement with a question. Is my father alive? Remember, Joseph's inquired from his brothers on each trip as to the welfare of your father. How is your father? How is your father? But now he asks, how is my father? Their father is his father as well. Notice also that, as far as the text reveals, the brothers never get around to answering Joseph's inquiry about my father. How is my father? And they're speechless, at least in the text. In fact, initially what we're told is they cannot answer him. Instead, the magnitude of what they heard just sinks in, and the brothers are dismayed when they come to process. This man is Joseph, who we sold. They're dismayed. Joseph had trouble speaking in verse 1 because of his emotions. The brothers likewise have trouble speaking because of emotions, but their emotions are far from the same emotions as Joseph's at this moment. As they comprehend who this man is, surely they cannot help but fear what Joseph's revelation might mean. They've sold him and assumed he was dead. Judah even admitted that. Yet here he is. That dismay is likely written all over their faces. Joseph reveals himself. Then, since the brothers are unable to speak, Joseph keeps talking. In the next verses, Joseph goes on and he forgives his brothers. Verse 4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please come closer to me. And they came closer. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. We'll stop again for a moment, but these verses that we just read, they provide us one of the clearest statements of God's sovereignty that we can find in the entire book of Genesis. These are also the words that open up the path to reconciliation. The brothers, as we just saw in verse 3, they're too stunned to speak. So Joseph says, come closer. He assures them, I really am Joseph, your brother. They need to look past all his Egyptian trappings. They need to look past all the accoutrements of royalty. He is the one they sold into slavery. Now, if you think about it, that mention of them selling him in slavery, that should have been sufficient to convince them that's who he really is. Because there is no way the ruler of Egypt could have known they sold their brother that no longer is into slavery. That's one thing they've carefully never said. Not even to Dad. They don't talk about that. The brothers had certainly never been the one to tell anyone what they'd done to their younger brother. I've got to believe that even Benjamin, who's with them, didn't know the history at all. So when he hears this blurred out, things got to start bouncing around in his head a little bit. It doesn't compute because I can't imagine he even knows. Remember, Benjamin, he was young. He was at home with his father when everything went down between Joseph and his older brothers. While the other brothers were stunned, I'm sure Benjamin's just confused. But Joseph then goes on, and he offers amazing words of forgiveness. Still, we need to see that Joseph's words of forgiveness are built upon his understanding of God's sovereign control. Joseph was under no delusion that his brothers had not really meant evil against him. When they sold him in slavery, they wanted to do evil. He has not fooled himself into thinking otherwise over the years. He did not rewrite history in his mind as he looked back with the age of time and concluded that, things weren't as bad as I thought they were. No, Joseph, he's honest about history. He knew that all those years ago, they did not care if he lived or if he died. In fact, if you remember, he knew that many of them preferred that he would die, but then they decided we could make more money if we sold him. At the same time, though, Joseph also knew that God controlled what had happened to him. The brothers were by no means off the hook, guilt-wise. They were not off the hook because God was in control, but Joseph's knowledge that God was in control, it changed how Joseph viewed the situation. God had planned all along, Joseph understood, to use their evil intent as the means by which he would get Joseph into just the right place for his sovereign purposes. They may have meant for Joseph to die, but God meant to accomplish the preservation of much life through the very same event. And for that reason, Joseph is able to look at his brothers and tell them, "Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves." In fact, rather than remain disgusted with themselves, what the brothers needed to learn is that they too must accept God's plan for everything that happened. And for that matter, they need to accept God's plan for everything that is yet to happen. They're only 2 years into this famine. God's revealed that truth. Things are going to get much, much worse. In the coming years, Joseph says there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. That little comment there at the end of verse 6, that maybe doesn't seem like much to you, but it's saying a lot. I remember some pretty bad springs when I was growing up in North Dakota. We plant in the spring in North Dakota, and there were times when the fall had been unusually dry, so there wasn't a lot of moisture prepared in the soil, and then there were times on top of that winter was dry without a lot of snow, and then the spring continued to be dry. So when it came time to plant, things were really dry. That combination meant that the fields were dry when it was time to put the crops in. But I can never remember a time when the farmers did not go out and put the crops in. The farmers knew that, yes, the ground was dry, but it was still tillable. They could still break it up and they could still put seed in. The ground was dry, but they also knew further down, even though we've had all this dry fall, this dry winter, this dry spring, there's moisture further down under the ground. If a little bit of rain would come along, just enough to allow the seeds to sprout, they could get the roots down to that lower moisture, and there'd be a crop. It may not be a great crop, but there were still expectations of a crop. That little phrase at the end of verse 6, that indicates that the first 2 years of famine were so bad that there's no longer any hope of crops at all. until the rain returns. The ground was so dry that it had become baked to the point where it was no longer tillable. There was no moisture for plant roots left to seek out. There was no hope for a crop, so the farmers would not bother plowing because there was no chance of harvest. All that would happen is they'd lose whatever amount of grain they put in the ground. Joseph said, that's the current situation. And from what God has revealed, Joseph knows there's 5 more years before this is over. This was far longer than any unprepared people could possibly survive. They couldn't just wait it out. The brothers' very presence in Egypt proves that this is longer than they could wait out, because they're down in Egypt trying to buy food because otherwise they'll starve. And there's 5 more years to go. That's the point. That's the point Joseph is making. Egypt is not unprepared because God sent Joseph here to prepare Egypt. Joseph's God-given role was to preserve life. And to do that, God sent Joseph to Egypt, even by their evil hands. And then he arranged all the circumstances over these years so that now Joseph is, as he says, I'm a father to Pharaoh, I'm lord of all this household, of his household, I'm ruler over all the land of Egypt. These are some impressive titles. But if you look at this entire speech Joseph gives, he talks more about God than he talks about himself. Joseph, yeah, he's in a great place here in Egypt, but Joseph's focus is on God. Look what God has done. In Joseph's view, the brothers are not ultimately responsible for his enslavement. God is. Because God was the one who used that as the means to accomplish his plan. The other thing that Joseph understands is that God's plan is good. Yeah, it may have been painful, but it was good. Look at verse 7. God sent me before you to preserve a remnant in the earth. God sent me before you to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Literally, the word there, great deliverance, is the word a great supply. Well, both the word remnant and the word supply, those two words, they're used elsewhere in the Old Testament with great theological significance. God preserves a remnant, and God does it by giving great supply. The fact that God preserves his promises, the way that God is faithful to his word, is through preserving a remnant, ensuring survivors of every judgment he brings. Joseph recognizes that God placed him into this role to serve a good, sovereign purpose. The lives of his family, they're just some of the lives that God is saving through his placement of Joseph into this position of ruler here over all of Egypt. And for all these reasons, Joseph looks at his brothers and forgives them. We could summarize his speech simply, guys, I forgive you. You tried to harm me, but God used your efforts to accomplish his plan. It's a good plan. It's a plan that's so good that the hard path that I traveled to get to this point makes all of that irrelevant. That's how good this plan is. I'm content with what God is doing. So guys, I forgive you. Joseph forgives his brothers. Which leads us to Joseph provides for his family. Verse 9. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me and do not delay. You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks and your herds and all that you have. There I will also provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come, and you and your household and all that you have would be impoverished. Behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth which is speaking to you. Now you must tell my father of all my splendor in Egypt and all that you have seen, and you must hurry and bring my father down here. Joseph shifts his concern now to his father in these verses. But as he does, he still continues to stress the sovereignty of God. Notice how Joseph refers to my father in verse 9 and verse 13. He kind of wraps these verses with his concern for his father's well-being. But at the same time, the message in the verses is that only God can accomplish all the amazing things that has happened to Joseph. Joseph wants his brothers to hurry home and tell his father about the great things God has done. Joseph isn't bragging about his position, he's bragging about God. God has done this. Of course, if you think about it, this is not an easy message that Joseph is asking his brothers to carry home to dear old dad. In order to tell Jacob that Joseph is alive and exceedingly well in Egypt, they're going to have to back up a few years, aren't they? They're going to have to go all the way back to the beginning when they handed that bloody, multicolored coat or tunic to their dad. And they're going to have to tell how Joseph came to be in Egypt in the first place. The brothers will have to acknowledge their own sins. They'll have to acknowledge God's mysterious ways then in transforming those sinful actions and taking those actions and turning them to such great good. Some serious confession lies in their future. But such confession is necessary if the family is going to find healing and reunification. And reunification is clearly Joseph's desire for his family. He assures his brothers that he will provide for them and for their many households. At this point, they're households. They're not a household. Each brother has his own household. And he'll provide for all these remaining years of the famine yet to come. There's a place here where he can do that in Egypt. So he says, go home, collect everything you have, collect your families, and come on back, and I'll let you leave in this region of Goshen. There you can live as a place that will provide for everything you need for you and your flocks and your herds. Hurry, bring everyone down because the famine's not going to let up. In fact, he says, bring everyone down, including my father, Jacob. They need to convince Jacob that Joseph is able to take care of them now. They need to go home and tell Jacob that the future of the family, the good of the family lies in Egypt, not in Canaan. There's reason to leave. Notice that the brothers are witnesses as well as messengers. They're to carry the message back to Jacob. But in verse 12, Joseph points out that they're also to share what they've seen with their own eyes as well as heard with their own ears. They've seen that Joseph is clearly in a position to do everything that he's promised. Furthermore, they've heard with their own ears that Joseph is who he claims because he spoke to them directly with his own lips. That probably means he was talking directly in Hebrew without going through an interpreter. But it's also that there's no intermediary, there's no confusion. This is the direct message. And they, including Benjamin, Joseph's full brother, remember Jacob's favored son, all of them can authenticate the message. Their eyewitness testimony that they can give. For that reason, Jacob has no reason to fear moving the family to Egypt. Joseph, his favored son, will provide. Joseph provides for his family. And that leads to the final verses that we want to consider this evening. Joseph reconciles with his brothers. He reconciles at last. Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. And Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers and wept on them, and afterwards his brothers talked with him. More emotions. Almost like The Princess Bride, right? Where the little boy is listening and he says, oh, kissing again. More emotions. More weeping, more hugging and kissing as well here. Joseph begins with his brother Benjamin. He also weeps and kisses all his other brothers. The point where you get is there is no animosity now between them. There is only total forgiveness. Yet look at the final phrase. Our narrator, Moses, here, as he's telling us this account, he announces that his brothers talked with Joseph. They talked. Hang on to that phrase now and flip back to Genesis 37. Remember, all the problems start back in Genesis 37. That's when we began this section. And look at verse 4 of Genesis 37. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. They could not speak to him on friendly terms. Now, verse 15, his brothers talked with him. Years ago, decades now, the hatred that the brothers held toward Joseph was such that they could not speak to him on friendly terms, but now they can talk to him. That breach, that hatred had created between Joseph and his brothers for so many years, that breach is closing. Surely all is not healed at this point. There's a decades of pain and animosity, but the breach is closing. The healing process has begun. All the hatred caused is being undone. We call this reconciliation. Reconciliation. Hostilities have ceased. Peace is taking place. The mending of relationships is underway. Joseph reconciles with his brothers. Now, we are not finished with Joseph's story. Really, remember, this is Jacob's story. There's still some steps in the passing of the promises from Jacob to his sons. But we've made a huge stride tonight in relieving so much of the tension that spanned years and chapters here in Jacob's family. Tonight, we've seen sin finally get dragged out into the light. And by dragging into light, that allows for forgiveness and the beginning of reconciliation. So as we think about these things, what can we learn from our text this evening? I think that is a particularly important question for us to ask, considering how many of us have real-life need for reconciliation in some of the relationships in our own life. What can we learn tonight? Well, the core idea that we can learn from this text is that reconciliation requires forgiveness, which requires recognizing God's sovereign control over all circumstances. I know, it's a long line, right? It's a long sentence. Let me read it again. Reconciliation requires forgiveness, which requires recognizing God's sovereign control over all circumstances. The goal is reconciliation, but we can't get there without taking the steps that lead up to it. That's key. Reconciliation is where we want to get, but we need to follow the steps that God gives us to get there. Forgiveness must come first. Reconciliation requires forgiveness. And until we've forgiven those who wrong us, we cannot find real reconciliation. We might be able to pretend for a while. In fact, that's what a lot of people want to do. They don't want to really forgive, but they want to pretend as if we're still okay with each other. But what happens without forgiveness is you have the seeds of bitterness that get planted into your life. And those seeds begin to grow. So while we may act like there's no longer hostility, we might even feign peace, it's not real. We also continue to think then, because it's not real, how we've been wronged. Over and over it plays out in our mind. We've been wrong. And once that seed of bitterness is planted, let me just say we can be assured we will not face a 7-year famine with that seed. It will grow. It will grow and it will kill. It will kill the reconciliation process. There will come a time when the person will wrong us again, or at least we'll perceive we've been wronged again, and just like that, open hostilities erupt. We cannot have reconciliation without forgiveness. That's why we must back up another step. We can't have reconciliation, the goal, without forgiveness, but we cannot find forgiveness without recognizing God's sovereign control over all circumstances. The reason, typically, that we need to forgive someone is because that person has wronged us. That person sinned against us. Now, there may be misperception on occasion, but usually there's genuine wrong. Sometimes we've done some wrong to create the wrong. There's back and forth. But by the time we get to the point where we need to be reconciled, there's right? We need forgiveness. There's a wrong involved. There's sin. But we cannot focus only on that fact. It's truth, but it's not the only truth. We need to put that wrong, that sinful action, in a much larger context, the context of God's sovereignty. Whatever wrong was done to us did not come outside God's sovereign control. That the wrong, in fact, was part of God's plan for our lives. It did not happen by accident. It happened by planning. God's planning. It was the means through which God was accomplishing his purpose. It was designed into the path that God had for our lives. And God's plan is always a good plan. That means that wrong, whatever it was, no matter how heinous it may appear to us, was God's plan to lead us to what he calls will be a good plan. We must accept that truth because that allows us to begin to release our anger toward the person who wronged us. That person is guilty before God of sinning. But we can accept that God, nonetheless, is accomplishing a good purpose. Those two things can both be true. In fact, for us to be able to forgive, we must affirm that both those things are true. That person has sinned, so they've sinned against God ultimately, not against us. That's true. But God is accomplishing a good purpose even with that sin. If we ever start to doubt this truth amid the pain of life, all we need to do is think of the cross. Think of the cross. God allowed sinful men to crucify the only sinless man. And that was the means by which God provided the just, righteous merit for our salvation. Furthermore, then God even takes that heinous sin of those men upon Christ, and he adds our sin against him and uses that as the means for our salvation when we place our faith in Christ. What a good plan. What a plan. And yet it's a plan that incorporated the most heinous act that mankind has ever committed. We must recognize God's sovereign control over all circumstances. We say that. We see it in Genesis over and over again, that God's in control, and we can, on Sunday, we can give that answer, but God's in control of all circumstances. That is the foundation that allows us to forgive those who have sinned against us. Which, by the way, does not mean that we will necessarily see how their sin leads to a good plan. God tells us it does. Here in Joseph, he was able to see it. In chapter 45, Joseph was given the privilege, I would call it, of seeing how God used the sinful actions of his brothers for a good purpose. But remember, this is Joseph of chapter 45. I don't believe that Joseph of chapter 37 could see, as he walked behind those Midian slavers, how God was using that for a good plan. I don't think that the Joseph of chapter 39 and 40 could see how God was using the sin of his brothers as good when he was sitting there in prison, in Pharaoh's prison for those years. Yet through all those years, Joseph, as slave, as a prisoner, his faithfulness demonstrates that he did not need to see how God allowed the circumstances of his brother's evils to accomplish his good plan. Joseph simply remained confident that God is in sovereign control, and he served faithfully. That's important for us to remember because, frankly, we have no guarantee that we will ever reach our own Genesis 45. You know, our lives may only get to Genesis 39 when Joseph is a slave, or Genesis 40 is a prisoner. We may not get to 45 in our lives. We may never know how the sin against us leads to the good that God has promised. Still, we can trust God's sovereign control. We don't have to see how it will fully play out to accept by faith that it is good. It is that we trust in God's sovereign plan what allows us to actually forgive. Trusting in God's sovereign plan. It's not because they haven't wronged us, it's because God's going to use that wrong for his purposes. And forgiveness must come before reconciliation. Reconciliation requires forgiveness, which requires recognizing God's sovereign control over all circumstances. Now, one last item. We cannot forget that all that we've seen tonight even is built upon the foundation of God's transforming work. We spent these chapters where Joseph tested his brothers to see, has God transformed them? Because God's transforming work prepared the way for the initiation of reconciliation. That transforming has to come before reconciliation can be initiated. Joseph's forgiveness is based on God's sovereign control. Yet Joseph wisely tested for God-generated transformation before he sought reconciliation. There can be no ceasing of hostilities, which, remember reconciliation, ceasing of hostilities, replacement with peace. There's no ceasing of hostilities when one side is actively engaged in hostility. There has to be a transformation before reconciliation. But even with the transformation, we won't have reconciliation without forgiveness. And tonight, we've seen the transformation previous weeks. The point tonight is that we also see forgiveness. And that brings reconciliation to the forefront. Reconciliation requires forgiveness, which requires recognizing God's sovereign control over all circumstances. We want reconciliation, but we need the steps that God has given us to get there. Father, I pray that you would help all of us to be in a position to rejoice as you bring reconciliation into our lives. Father, we know that so often sin ruptures relationships. Father, may we be men and women who are able to quickly forgive because we trust in you. We trust in you and you alone. We know that you are in control of all circumstances, so we are able to really forgive. Father, we pray that you might mercifully also transform those who need to be transformed so that we can pursue reconciliation. And as it comes about, may we give you all the praise and the glory for your great work, knowing that all reconciliation comes only because of your good, merciful hand. Father, you are a good God. Regardless of what we encounter in our lives, we know you are a good God. So we give you all the praise for our Savior tonight, in whose name we pray. Amen.